Thank you all for coming here today and being a part of this seminal talk on dissent and discourse. The talk will focus on the role of artists in challenging cultural narratives by shifting perceptions in ways traditional media cannot, and the significance and relevance of dissent in a discourse, in politics and in art.
Thank you so much for your patience, and thank you for coming, the panelists and the audience, and helping us to take what is this very important conversation forward. So without further ado, I'm going to present my first question, which is a very obvious one, and I think should be talked about before any further conversation on dissent takes place. Perhaps Shazia, you'd like to take this first? Sure. Is there freedom without dissent?
No, I don't think so. Within any framework of freedom, dissent and dialogue are an essential part of. So I don't think it is possible. And I think, as Leonardo da Vinci said, nothing strengthens authority so much as silence. So the need to speak out, even the voices of dissent, they actually contribute to freedom of speech and expression both. So I think they both are important. They're two sides of the same coin, so to speak.
But I'm not sure that goes far enough, though I agree with Shazia entirely as far as she went. Yes, freedom of speech implies dissent. But the real question is, once you have exercised your freedom of speech, is there freedom after speech? Or do you survive or cope with a society in which you are stifled for having expressed your freedom of speech? In many ways, we're seeing that dissent can be curbed in multiple manners. One is certainly the old-fashioned school of locking people up and sending them to concentration camps or exiling them. But the other is quite simply telling their employers to fire them or preventing withholding advertisements in the publications that carry them and so on. There are various ways in which dissent can be stifled. And perhaps the more insidious and more sophisticated ways of doing so today are in many ways more dangerous because they preserve the illusion of freedom of speech while in fact severely restraining it.
Well, I think dissent and freedom are two faces of the coin. If we do not dissent, how can there be freedom? And in a democracy like ours, which is probably one of the finest democracies in the world, I think we still have spaces where we dissent. And dissent is very important for any growth, whether it's a civil society, whether it's the process of politics, whether it's the process of social development, even religion. You have to have the ability and the maturity to dissent. Without dissent, I think freedom cannot survive.
I think much is said already. I think I meant to put a plot into the conversation. I think from a perspective of an artist, I mean, I would say the idea of dissent is something to also kind of understand the social realities of today. So I think freedom is something which follows that, and in many contexts, if you try to kind of track down to kind of get the literal meanings of all these exercises, I think we eventually fail. But it is better to act, and I think sitting here, Kochi, almost like a site of dissent, I feel many voices of freedom are expressed in a land like this.
Yes, I think Dr. Tharoor put it very well, that there has to be a fearlessness to speak your mind. And if you are concerned about repercussions or concerned that you will be locked up or something like that, then it is impossible to express yourself freely and truly. So clearly, free speech and expression is a lifeline of any democracy. And any conversation about free speech would be incomplete without a reference to the arts, to theater, to music, to painting, sculpture, all of these are, you know, the lifeline of any society as well. And I will ask Mr. Komu, do you see art as a tool of dissent? How?
First of all, a big thank you for inviting me to kind of speak in a forum like this, because I think we have one important example who's exhibiting at the Kochi Muziris Biennale as a collateral project. Somebody who has proved and who has been a reactionary to the time which he lived in, who was a social activist. And then if you look at his complete works, I mean, you see that, I mean, there is a man, I mean, who has proved, a complete, a sense of understanding about the time he lived, and the demand of the time was reflecting in his work. And he created most of his work, which is very important. And, in fact, some of the works are very propaganda-based. There is a sense of left in his, in both the ways. I mean, what is left and what is also left. So both are reflecting very much in his process of working. So as an artist, when we, discussed about doing a biennial project in Cochin, the important or the conscious effort behind it was to build an ecosystem. That unless and until you are able to kind of create an ecosystem where you can, it's not just, the word dissent, where you can be creatively express your own concerns and get into a conversation. That is something which is very much lacking. You can't dissent into a place where nothing happens. There are many examples in front of us. But what we have proved here that I'm also speaking as a representative of artists who are participating in this Biennale, and they have proved that, through creative expressions, you can make a project or you can create people's movement, and it is led by artists. In that sense, I feel that, I don't know, I don't want to kind of play around the word dissent so much, because it has got multi-layered meanings, but in a context of today where we are all meeting, I think artists have contributed in creating a site where many discourses can happen.
So, when we spoke this morning very briefly, I think you talked about Kochi as a site for dissent, and you also talked about the need for multiple voices and the need to disrupt hierarchies. Could you like to maybe expand on that a little bit?
See, for us as a foundation, some of our main focuses is also to kind of celebrate diversity by, by acknowledging the fact that, this region is very multicultural, at the same time very cosmopolitan in its nature. And what, something which the people of Kochi carries as a badge of honor is the idea of cosmopolitanism. So when you are launching a project like this, into a space like this, understanding the larger Indian art context, what Kochi creates, again I'm reiterating the word, Kochi creates an ecosystem which is much needed. By the exercise of doing these last two editions, what we have succeeded in doing is taking the art to the common man, where articulation is made possible, the new narratives about the region's history is told to people, the pride of the local pride is improved, and at many levels, I think the last two editions of the biennial have succeeded in doing what a biennial should do in today's context. But this edition has taken it beyond. What Sudarshan has been able to do by bringing multiple possibilities of introducing diverse art practices. He is actually erasing boundaries. So what happens is Kochi becomes a site of education. It's it becomes Sudarshan's iteration forming in the people of an eye becomes, or a kind of a key to enlightenment, in one way or the other. That way, the whole exercise is making Kochi as a site of insights. So that should be, our focus. And as a foundation, we are able to do these kind of exercises. At the same time, I'm again putting that, education is one of the primary focus of this institution. We have a 3-tier approach this year. We have Sudarshan's a very, very well discussed professional project at one end. Then you have a Students' Biennale where we are doing a national outreach project with 55 art institutions, working with 465 artists. Then we have an ABC project, Art by Children, where we are reaching out that art has to be taught in institutions to kind of cultivate and create a cultural space even in the growing premises. And if you look at the larger context, what Kochi is actually doing in the time like where everything is in conflict, Kochi is actually doing a much needed cultural acupuncture, which will benefit the nation. So I think we should accumulate, this energy to kind of maybe lead this nation culturally a bit more plural, bit more multicultural, and also celebrate, the diversity.
Thank you. Dr. Pandey, would you like to respond?
Well, I want to go now to the landscape of discourse. And I think I'd like to bring back B.M. Anand at this point, because he was a person who inhabited this space, because a lot of important decisions and a lot of interesting ideas come in these in-between spaces. And the discursive spaces, which are, what Riaz was talking of, Kochi being one of them, I think B.M. Anand and maybe even Hussain started these discursive spaces when you see the great painting of the spider and the lamp, and you see the wonderful dystopic and entropic landscapes of B.M. Anand, which have not really been seen by the public in the way they should have been seen. He talks of a kind of a world order which is very much part of his imagined mind and is a reaction to the independence of India, a reaction to the Fabian socialism of Nehru, anti-imperialism, looking at creating a space for discourse. And I think the point you said about dissent and freedom, it's in these discursive spaces that you can be dissenting and you can have complete freedom. And I also think that the artistic freedom or creating art for the sake of creativity is a very, very important area. And you see people like IYY in China who have got over that hump. His voice was silenced for a year, and when you see his big show at the Royal Academy last year, it really was a salute to the freedom of expression through the discursive space of art. And I think these are very, very important spaces, and artists have a great responsibility, which I think probably Kochi being one of the places which offers that platform is wonderful. And I think B.M. Anand being present here is also a natural fruition of this discursive space.
Dr. Tharoor, I'm going to bring it back to you. Again, the question of disrupting hierarchies. So we're doing it in art. Do you think dissent can do it in other areas of public and social life?
I'll get to that, but let me just pick up on something that Alka said first, because one of the thoughts that struck me, and I didn't know much about B.M. Anand's work, I see his own daughter is here, so she may be able to cast light on it, but I get the sense that surely one can trace the roots of his anti-imperialism to the fact that his own beloved older brother, at the age of 12, was a victim of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, was one of the first children killed. And in many ways, I mean, that was the single worst atrocity of the British Raj, if you discount, of course, the reprisals of 1858. But in 1919, for a British brigadier to come and shoot large numbers, hundreds, they claim 379, the Indian side claims 1,400 plus, the truth is somewhere in between, but unarmed men, women and children, large numbers of women and children, massacring them in a walled garden where they'd gathered to celebrate Baisakhi. with the only exit being a narrow gate at which the brigadier stations his troops so he can shoot them like a turkey shoot. Practically no bullet didn't claim a victim. And at the end of all of that, as you know, the British would not allow the Indians to tend to the dead and the wounded. So people lay moaning and writhing in agony for 24 hours unattended because no one was allowed to go and help them, amid the festering dead bodies as well. Indians were forced to crawl on their bellies in the street outside the park. This psychopath was then rewarded by the British, who collected large sums of money, the equivalent of £250,000 today, to reward him for his massacre. And Rudyard Kipling, the great so-called apostle of Victorian literature, hailed him as the man who saved India. Now, when you see how this was emblematic, it seems to me, of everything that was wrong about empire. The wanton cruelty, the massacre, but also the brutality, the racism, the callousness, the indifference to human suffering, and particularly to the lives and dignity of Indians. And I haven't even told half the things that Daya did before and around and after it. It seems to me in some ways that anyone who lived through that period, let alone someone like B.M. Anand, was directly affected by seeing his own elder brother's body being cremated as a result of having innocently gone to a garden, surely had to develop some very, very profound, visceral reactions to the process of imperial conquest that had created, that had made this possible. And therefore it strikes me that, to understand his work, and particularly the sort of more ideological statements kind of art, which is different from his more commercial, more popular, successful art, seems to me rooted in this colonial atrocity in a way that's impossible to escape. And I'm sorry, I got away from your question, which I've already...
No, but I think that's a very, very sensitive point, and you've really come to the core of what and how B.M. Anand changed, because his father, before that, was a great, great loyal servant of the empire. And it was the brother's death which changed a lot of things around. And I think it's
And for
really,
many, I mean, you've got Rabindranath Tagore
Yeah.
returning his knighthood,
Yes.
saying that he couldn't possibly retain that knighthood in this incongruous context of humiliation. You've got Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children,
Yeah.
which is obviously in that part quite autobiographical, talking about how for his Kashmiri father, that was when he felt he became an Indian and not just a Kashmiri. So in many ways it was a seminal moment in the psychology of Indian anti-imperialism. But I think for somebody as directly personally affected as B.M. Anand as a child, it must have been even more profound than it was for many others.
Shashi, if I can jump in. What is also very repugnant and despicable about this whole incident, the Jallianwala massacre, is the presence of Indian troops and the regiment there. So as General Dyer made that announcement and asked the Indian troops to fire, it was a particular regiment, and I wouldn't like to name it, but they were following. So it's also, B.M. Anand also fought against that. Not just the imperialists, so to speak, but the indoctrination and the slave-like mentality, the whole colonial hangover that we retain. So it was also a fight not against just some political masters, but the puppet-like game that they played, and the slavish mentality of subservience that people took on, which led to, which perpetuated slavery and the inferiority, so to
Actually,
speak.
while we're on that, it was the Gurkhas, let's say it. And what happened was that they found themselves in an identical position a dozen years later in Peshawar in 1931. And this time they refused to fire and they laid down their arms rather than kill unarmed protesters. And this was hailed at the time by everyone from Muhammad Iqbal to Motilal Nehru. The heroism of these soldiers who give up their careers, in effect, rather than follow these blatantly illegal
perfect
orders.
act of dissent, I would say.
Absolutely, dissent.
So actually, I just want to make a slight correction that B.M. Anand was born almost 10 years after his brother was killed in Jallianwala Bagh. But that attests to the even more.
Wasn't B.M. Anand born in 1918? I thought he was
born in
1 year.
1928.
20, I misread it.
But that attests to the horrificness of that particular incident and how it affected his family. Because even 10 years later, the children who were born even after this incident bore the repercussions of this horrible incident and the way this child was massacred. So yes, so I think dissent comes in many different forms. I was reading somewhere that even Brexit is an act of dissent for many people who felt marginalized in Europe, etc. So I suppose it depends how you look at it. But again, to return to my question of disrupting hierarchies, do you think dissent has the capacity, addressed to both Shazia and to Dr. Tharoor?
Well, I'll just give a short answer, because by definition, dissent is against the powerful. So inevitably, you don't dissent against those who are younger than you or weaker than you or inferior to you in social stature or have less power than you politically. So it seems an axiomatic question to me. Dissent is always against those who in a hierarchical world have greater power, influence, authority, age, seniority, whatever, to you. And so the act of dissent, the question goes back to your first question, are you free to dissent? Are you free to continue to dissent after you have dissented? These, I think, are the important, relevant, and enduring questions. But all dissent is against hierarchy.
Absolutely. So when we talk about dissent and the permission or ability to do that, it is constitutionally valid, is there, the right to the freedom of speech and expression. So there is absolute freedom to practice, preach, even proselytize religion, and to choose a religion of your choice, so to speak. But if you go further, if you dissect it further, is there really any freedom within the religion? Is there freedom within the religion not to practice the religion? And within the same framework, within the different castes and grades of a religion, is everybody equal? Then in another religion, are men and women of the same religion have the same rights? And also, is the freedom of individual as as important as the freedom of the community? So you have to dissect it further. Absolute religion of community or larger sections is there, but within those sections, so to speak, whether it's the caste system within the Hindu religion, or the deeply entrenched patriarchal beliefs in almost all the religions, and the fight that if you look at the LGBT community to be the way they are, and for women to be equals to men, that fight remains. Also the fight of an individual to be an atheist or to be agnostic or to be a non-conformist, as opposed to the community, so to speak, is also a fight and an important act of rebellion, dissent, whichever way you want to describe it. So I think while the Constitution protects your right to exercise any belief or religion, so to speak, if you have faith in any religion, the spaces within the religion, in terms of classes, castes, genders, is not there.
Mr. Komu?
See, one of the important metaphors which the Biennale Foundation operates is very much close to the conversation just happening. See, in today's context, one of the major issue is religion, and we have suffered, many, issues because of that, and we continue to, suffer that. But what gives us energy as an organization, which has been kind of, following a certain history of social action of guerrilla, where people have come together for transforming, a society. It is not just to be related with the communist legacy of this region, but the people who lived before that, the kind of social reforms. And religion was always a subject of discourse in a space like this. And what fascinates us is the metaphor which the Biennale uses in exercising the Biennale, or bringing art projects here. I would like to kind of give an anecdote which, which has always been shared by or discussed as something in contrary to what has happened in India's excavation sites. Ken Panikar, who's been leading the Muziris project, and also PJ Cherian, they always shares a very interesting anecdote, which can be a kind of a lesson to a lesson or a takeaway from, the biennial premise. They explain in Putnam excavation site, once you dig 1 meter, you're crossing a history of 1,000 years. Then you dig another 1 meter, you're crossing the history of another 1,000 years. That's like 2,000 years of history you cover. And that becomes a site of education. And scientific evidences are used to prove an excavation site, unlike mythological remarks are brought in. So once you dig another 1 meter, you're going beyond all these troubling religions of our time. So that metaphor actually gives us tremendous energy to kind of activate, art, discourses, the voice of descendants, voice of, multiplicity, voice of plurality. I think that should be one direction we all should take to kind of maybe converge, in a point to solve many of our complexities of time.
So Shazi, I read one of your interviews where you said that you don't want to protest on the street and that you would rather go to the parliament and that express your point or your dissent there. So do you really think that there is space for dissent within politics, within political parties and in the parliament?
Well, it's antithetical, so to speak, because that is the whole idea of democracy and a multi-party system and a democracy at that.
Yeah, but we're talking about ideal versus reality.
Yes, absolutely. So as a foot soldier of the Anna Hazare movement, one felt that it's important to disrupt the system the way things were, to go out there and instead of being an enraged member of the society, be an engaged citizen, so to speak, and go and talk about civic rights and disrupt this whole conversation in the narrative of Hindu, Muslim, and Jat, and Ahir, and Dalit, and Brahmin, but talk about citizenry, so to speak. But you realize that laws, and that's how the transition of Anna Hazare movement to Aam Aadmi Party happened. So at that point of time, it was important to go there, to be responsible, so to speak, to be a part of parliament where laws are actually made, and not contribute to political anarchy, but to strengthen the political institutions, so to speak, and therefore contribute to a more meaningful polity, so to speak, and also have different kinds of people, different factors, so to speak, as enabling qualification for a politician than the same old ones. Because the variables that are always at work are that of religion, regionalism, communalism, money factor, and what have you. So we wanted to change that, and that was a disruptive movement, so to speak. But, it is also very often democracy is a numbers game. So it is very much majoritarianism versus minoritism. So people will only get those leaders as they deserve. So, it's a case of demand and supply. So because they are takers, which is why politicians would offer the same fare that people would like as well. So it's a two-way process, really. And I think as people ourselves, as citizens, as voters, as consumers, we need to be more liberal. We need to accept the other, not just in the political space, but in the cultural space, in the social space, so to speak.
So it is possible.
Yes. And it is becoming. I think there is, overall, there is a whole trend. If you see Brexit, if you see winning of, coming of Donald Trump to power and what have you, of a certain right-wing nature of things, it's veering to that side. But I think also there are more voices because of social media. There are more individual voices also. There are many more voices of dissent. And the whole idea of manufactured consent is actually breaking down because there's smaller and other platforms available for individuals to make themselves heard.
I think what is also interesting is that we have this preconceived notion, as Dr. Tharoor said, that dissent is always against an institution or somebody who's more powerful than you. And in the same way, we assume that dissent is also against the majority. But that's not necessary. Dr. Tharoor?
No, there still is a footnote to your question, which Shazia didn't touch on, and she's right in everything she said. But just to add that, yes, in our system, we do have a problem with dissent within parties because of the anti-defection law, which was passed with the best of intentions to ensure that you wouldn't have Ayarams, Gayarams who would just hop parties for personal benefit whenever it suited them. But the result is now that on every issue, there is no dissent within a party. a party takes a position very, very often without consulting its members to ascertain how they really feel. And having the leadership having taken a position, a whip is now issued, unlike, say, the British parliamentary system, where a whip is only issued maybe 5% of the time for really important votes. In India, a whip is issued for every single vote, 100% of the time. And under the Anti-Defection Act, if you defy your party whip by not showing up or voting against it, you can be expelled from parliament. So that is a tremendously stifling restriction on the possibility of dissent within parties. Now, as Shazia says, what has happened is, as a result, that those who cannot dissent within the prescribed framework of their own party take their views to alternative spaces in the public. And that's where freedom of the press becomes important, because people who should actually have the ability to say what they want in the officially ordained forums of parliament and political parties are very often conducting their real debates on the TV channels and on social media, rather than doing so where we have voted for them to be doing it.
Well, Dr. Tharoor, I think you're a great
Or
example.
you have voted for us to be doing it, since I'm in that gang myself.
So, Dr. Tharoor, you're a great example of this. There have been instances where you have dissented against your own party position.
Don't remind me.
Well, you will be reminded in this forum, unfortunately. For instance, on the LGBT movement and your support of it, for which I think all of us are very grateful and appreciative. So what is your own position? I mean, my assumption with my limited knowledge of politics is that does compromise your position politically to speak the truth against what the party whips may or may not want to hear?
Well, no, there are various kinds of issues that matter more or less to the party leadership on different times. In fact, on LGBT, I was not taking a major political risk with my party leadership because they're quite sympathetic to the issue as well. I was taking a risk with my constituents, with some influential religious groups whose opposition could harm my prospects of re-election, etc., etc. So there were political risks, but they were not of that type. But whereas, for example, some of my views, when they're antithetical to the party's position on certain either beliefs or tactics even in the parliament and outside, either I can express them behind closed doors, which should be all right, but then there are always friendly, unhelpful leaks coming out of the party that reveal what I said behind closed doors and suddenly make an act of private dissent into a public dissent, which I had not intended it to be, thereby inviting the wrath of the leadership, etc. So that has a different kind of political consequence. And the other alternative I have is to just shut up and not express a view. When I know that I would rather not say what the party wants me to say, I simply choose not to say it. So, I mean, I was perhaps the only member of the Congress Party who thought our position on the so-called cartoon controversy was asinine, where we were actually going along with the politically expedient charge that a 1948 cartoon by Shankar about Nehru and Ambedkar was actually insulting to the Dalits, when neither of the principals portrayed in that cartoon at the time thought it was insulting, they rather enjoyed it. But somehow this ex post facto holier than thou thing created a huge firestorm in the parliament, and I had plenty of opportunities to distance myself from it because the cameras were all too willing. The mics were coming after me every time I stepped out of the house. But I chose silence. I don't say it with any particular pride, but as a politician, it was important for me to respect the fact that whether I agreed with it or not, my party had a view, and my expressing dissent from it would not be helpful to the party. And so I chose silence. Now, this is one of the ways in which dissent is stifled. Dissent doesn't always lead to discourse, Anita. Dissent sometimes leads to silence.
Yes, absolutely. So as a society, if we were to take it as a given that dissent is significant for creativity, for progress, and for public discourse, as a society, and here, as Shazia very helpfully pointed out, that we are going to get the leaders that we deserve eventually, and the leaders that we want. And as long as we are willing to vote for people of a certain kind, those people will remain in power. So my question is that as a society, what can we do to encourage free thinking and for people to express their views? And this is not about the government. This is, as a society, what can we do?
Okay.
Dr. Pandey?
I think we should just be fearless and say exactly what we want. And I think fearlessness comes with a great deal of thought and dissent, which goes within your own mind. And I think fearlessness is a very, very, how should I say, a mature sentiment. I'm not saying foolhardy, but to be really fearless. See the discourse, weigh the dissent. And I do think dissent is very important, because if everybody is agreeing, it's a very boring place. It's a very homogeneous space. And I think dissent is the key to your own personal growth. And without your personal growth, you cannot be fearless. And
But fearlessness becomes foolhardiness if it doesn't take into account the consequences of its expression. In other words, Gandhiji would always say, right, that he would say to British judges, yes, I have broken the law, and you must punish me to the fullest extent of your law, which I think is an illegitimate law, and I will accept the punishment because I'm not afraid of you and your law. That was Gandhiji's approach. Today what we're saying is, I want the right to dissent, but I don't want the consequences, I don't want the punishment. Or if the punishment is certain, then where is the distinction between fearlessness and foolhardiness? How much of a price are you paying, including perhaps the price to be deprived of the right to be fearless again? I mean, certainly fearlessness under Hitler, fearlessness under Stalin, fearlessness under Mao attracted fatal consequences, right? So is that fearlessness or is it foolhardiness?
I think, Shashi, I would like to come back very definitely to Indic wisdom. And belonging to a country which reeks of tapasya. When I talk of tapasya, I'm talking of what it is to be Indic. I'm not talking of Hindu, I'm not talking of religion, I'm talking of that particular thing which we call dharma. And I think we all have that internal compass. And we know when we are being fearless, and we know when we are being foolhardy. As Gandhi understood fearlessness, when he writes in his Experiments with Truth, what is the truth? So once we follow truth, we know what is fearlessness. And I think fearlessness is very important.
No, fearlessness is definitely very important, the act of courage. But like Dr. Tharoor mentioned, if it emanates from a deep-rooted ideology, which is based on prejudice to start with in the first place, it can also be, it can be very ugly. So if you really are seeking freedom of the true kind and looking at imbuing the society with thinking of a kind that accepts multilateral, different points of view, then you have to look at the units of conditioning. Because we are a product of our thoughts. Gandhi also said man, but I'll say woman is a product of her thoughts, what she thinks she becomes. So what do we think? How do we think and where do we get that from? Emanates from our conditioning. What are the units of conditioning? So it's a house. So do youngsters have a freedom to dissent? Do adults allow them to speak their mind? So whether it's young and the old, in terms of generation, women and men, and again the caste, our Dalits and the Brahmins and other grades that come with it. So I think that is also disruption of power hierarchies, social and political and economic, so to speak. So I think the units of conditioning, if you look at schools and colleges,
Education.
public spaces, will impact. I think it's really important that you do that. And also popular culture. What is popular culture? What is the kind of cinema you see? What are the kind of music you hear? What is the kind of art you're exposed to? So I think all these play a huge role in making a society multicultural and more accepting of the other. And of course, a good law enforcement system in place that ensures that rule of law prevails and the law and order agencies not to follow the political masters, but follow the constitution, which very solidly guarantees the very same rights that we are talking about within the framework of a constitution.
I just want to go back to actually the work of B.M. Anand. Talk of fearlessness then, and I would really want you to see his entire body of work in the book which is there, because when I curated the show the first time in Delhi, what I realized with the artist was his absolute fearlessness in the way he depicted his visual language. If you look at a lot of artists of his period, whether they are the modern masters, they actually did to some extent play to the market. B.M. Anand never did. And yet, in spite of that, he had a day job where he earned enough money, and if I may be right saying, the family had a full table and they never went hungry. So there was not the poor artist, but in his craft and art, there was absolute honesty, and that is the fearlessness I was talking about.
So you wouldn't see that as either a compromise or even leading a double life. The commercial artist doing pulp novel covers and film posters to make a comfortable living for the family while reserving his passion and his rage for work that in fact couldn't be published. And if you, just to supplement it, does that not also require then a democracy like India to allow him to do that? Because say, if the tables were reversed and he was not being a Stalinist ideologue in India, but rather being, let's say, a democratic ideologue in Stalin's Russia, and he had tried once to do paintings of which the government disapproved, he would never get other kinds of work either. So the price would have been different in another system.
I really like your question, Shashi, because it really proves the very point I wanted to make, that he was not a mercenary. He did not paint or draw just to earn the money. Even if you look at his book covers, his graphic work, there was truth and integrity in that. He was brilliant as a master of drawing, which he learned. He created great work for the beauty and joy of society. He was not making work just to, I mean, even when he was making work to earn money, there was honesty and integrity. And when you see his private work, there was complete fearlessness. And the kind of scratchboards that he's done, it just makes you kind of that whole wow effect. And if you see his entropic landscapes and those dystopic landscapes and, you know, the angels of death in them, which are part of his very anti-imperialistic stand, I really admire that fearlessness as an artist. And I think there's no harm if you have a day job to feed your family and you are not you know, compromising completely on that.
But that means also that art, for him, art for art's sake was good enough, but also art is an expression of angst of sorts against imperialism or industrialization.
I think it was
also a form of expression. So there was a balance. So while he, there's a famous sher, if I can quote.
If I may just interrupt for just 1 second. So when I did the research on the artist, and I think I spoke to the family, one of the things that came across to me was that his day job set him free. Because he earned money from the commercial illustrations, he wasn't obliged to please anybody with what he painted at night. It was to please himself, and I think it was definitely to communicate certain very strong political ideas, which were very important to him. A lot of people didn't understand them, a lot of people were made uncomfortable by it, and he didn't care. So yes, there definitely was fearlessness. And to come back to what I was talking about, Shazia, is that how can we create that fearlessness? And perhaps Mr. Komu would like to tell us, he has already created a space where people can come and have independent voices. What else can we do as a society?
Good, it's coming back to me when art has been, you know, discussed. I mean, so thank you for that. You know, the issue is like when there is fear in the air, you know, in a society like this today, where there is, you know, you are tolerating the intolerant, you know, there are multiple issues which one needs to chase, you know, that one becomes like, I mean, it is not just about the dissent, it is not just about fearlessness, it is about like, I mean, you know, how do you take a risk or how do you risk your life? And if you look at Indian art history, whether starting from like, I mean, the masters to today, any artist who have taken a decision to plunge into art, the first thing which he has done, understanding Indian conditions where there is no infrastructure, the government has not invested enough into kind of, you know, to building, you know, the possible spaces. What one is actually doing is taking a huge risk to become an artist. And that risk is not just in making art. That risk is in fighting for many possible ways of surviving. And I would actually use this platform to kind of congratulate all the artists and who have made it possible to become artists and to remain artists. So because we are fighting systems, we are fighting states, we are fighting intolerance, we are fighting many levels of oppressions, and we still survive and emerge and set up projects like this. So in that context, I think we should take it into a context that how we can make or start thinking a little bit more positive to use art to educate at least our next generation to become the better citizens of this country. So that's the remark I can make in a context like this.
So I'm going to bring it back to Shazia. Sorry to have interrupted you, Shazia. Perhaps you can tell us that sher now, but...
No, but the sher, talking about B.M. Anand and artists like him, and poets, authors who chose the path of disruptive work and not just towing the line and not conforming and pleasing the so-called bourgeoisie. The point that I wish to make is, if we also see this, the bleeding Buddha as well as...
Buddha bleeds, yeah.
The Buddha bleeds and this particular one, it was almost like a Pink Floyd, We don't need no education, we don't need a thought control because it's against indoctrination. But there's a sher of Majaz. It's an Urdu couplet and I shall translate it for you. So the poet says, "Hai mere sher go khawas pasand, lekin meri guftagoo awam se hai." Which means that my poetry or my artistic expression could be for the elite, but my conversation is with the masses. So I think that pretty much comes to my mind when I think of Mr. Brij Anand and the work that I've seen so far. That's all I wanted to say.
That's a wonderful note to end this conversation, I think. If there are any questions from the audience, I think we have time to take just a few. Okay.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here and listening to you all talking about dissent. And my question is to Dr. Tharoor. And I'm a filmmaker haunted by INB ministry last 8 months. They are making my life hell. And every single festival, my film selected, they track down and refusing giving the censor exemption. It is a same-sex love story which is happening in Kerala. Last May, I contacted Dr. Tharoor's office with a link, and we are showing a private screening. We are screening in Delhi, and we don't get that positive response from your office. But still, we are fighting in the court, and our current INB ministry ignoring the High Court verdict, which is favorable to us, and going appeal and appeal. Now the Hindutva vigilantes, they're claiming that they're coming, and recently we tried to show it in Kerala Film Festival, and naturally the INB ministry blocked it, and we went to court and we had a special order to show the film there. And then these vigilante groups come and doing the protest and go to my home and my crew's home, physically harming them. And all atrocities are happening there right now. And we are talking retrospectively about some dissent, which is a little bit irritating for me. And yesterday, one of my ADs, assistant director, got arrested. And today he released in some other charges. Right now, we are living in a world, actually dissent means anything. Actually, the sheer fear spreading all around, and there is, no matter which party is ruling, and we are getting authoritarian every moment, and it is scary. That's all.
Okay, well, first of all, I'm really sorry to hear about all your troubles and your predicament. I think that obviously we can be assured that I have no sympathy for either ministries harassing creative artists and filmmakers, or indeed for the battles that you've been forced to fight. With Hindutva vigilantes, I think you mentioned, and others, none of those people have the slightest of my sympathies. if you found the response from my office somewhat lukewarm, I think you may have been the person who asked for us to sponsor a screening in Delhi, which would have been politically unwise, not just for us, but also for you, because then you would have been identified with a particular politician from a particular party sponsoring your screening. And this is why we thought it was in both your interest and ours that we support you in other ways, including by, you didn't approach us, for example, on these other troubles you've been having. Obviously, there are limitations as to how much somebody in the opposition can help you with, but I would have been glad to try. And maybe having heard this BJP member here speaking so passionately about dissent, you can try her after the event.
That's a good... Yes. So I rest my case. The very fact that I'm here and I'm part of this conversation says something, doesn't it?
Okay.
That
And
is
on
also an
fair and authoritative, one thing is true, that you have been given a rough ride and you should resist it. But the fact that you can sit here and speak about it and get the sympathy of the audience and of us, and that we can continue to fight the battle, shows that we aren't yet, thank God, an unfree society. But there are people certainly trying to impose restrictions on our freedom and their interests, and we have to stand up against them. But thank God the system still allows us to stand up against them.
We don't need flexibility. We need a situation in society we can publicly express our opinion, and we can write, and we could get for
No, in our country there's also been gradation. So in other words, you're free to express your opinion right now. Tomorrow, if you wrote an op-ed, I'm sure some newspaper would carry it. But when you want to screen a film, somehow the yardsticks are more restrictive in our country. That's always been the case. Things you could say in books, you could not say in films in India till very recently. No, I agree with you. I have written against film censorship. I'm just saying, however, that has been the reality of our country, even in freer,
Dr.
more liberal
Thiru,
times.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah,
but
we should move on.
Maybe, please. Thank you.
My question to Dr. Shashi Tharoor, my dear friend, you always quote about the superpower, and also you say that although we are superpower, we are super poor.
That's right.
30 crores of people not having a meal a day. So a lot of dissent happening in India for the last many, many years. But the super poor is still the super poor. How do you comment on that?
Well, it goes off the topic, James, in all fairness.
But it's a very general topic of dissent.
It is. But, you know, the truth is that we have to deal with our poverty very clearly. And I've often argued that whether we grow at 6% or at 9%, what really matters is the bottom 25% of this society, because it's in their name that everything is being done or not done by successive governments of all political hues. The point is that, that we should obviously be able to pursue different ways of doing that. I think that all this talk of superpower is massively overblown. And as I said, you know, how can we speak of being a superpower when we're still super poor? We have to attend to those priorities too. And to my mind, that is an area where honestly there is no real problem of dissent, because pretty much every view has its moment in the sun in our political discourse. You can be not just a communist or a left of center socialist or a social democrat or whatever. You can actually be a raging Trotskyite, Maoist, or Naxalite. As long as you don't pick up a gun to pursue your point of view, you're free to express it, to convert.
My point is, the mainstream political parties, are they failed? Because in the tribal areas with the Dalits,
Sir, I'm
the
sorry.
Maoists are getting more strength.
Actually,
But they're
I
allowed
don't
to
know, but
dissent.
it's of dissent. Okay.
if I may request,
They're allowed to dissent.
this conversation is about dissent, and can we please keep the questions to the topic at hand, please?
Hi. I'd like to go back to the conversation, yes. And I think it's kind of entirely a semantic argument to make if you say that dissent can only exist against hierarchies, or dissent can only exist against power or dominance, when in fact dissent is essential to discourse. And this idea of fearlessness that has been moving around in this conversation is also in that way kind of difficult to grapple with, because fearlessness in this way seems to imply that you need to have the articulation to express your dissent. And that is an entirely privileged argument, because it's not that we're a country that deserves the leaders that we have, it's because not all of us have the privilege to be dissentous or to disagree or to express that dissent. So I guess I wonder if maybe it's a semantic argument and we need a new language to discuss this, or whether the way that the language is being used needs to be kind of fundamentally changed.
So we're talking about a democratization where everybody can access that space of dissent.
I mean, I guess, but maybe it's also to reconsider the way in which dissent is being discussed in this conversation. If dissent can only belong to the privileged.
We have lots of mics.
Yeah, getting mics on both sides.
I think, I just want to go back to what the writer Anand said recently in one of the conversations. The problem is also happening in today's time is the way we appropriate, with certain values from a completely opposite perspectives. You try to kind of hijack it. So he said the word radical, which was something considered one of the most original, concepts of, innovation, creativity, thinking. In today, that the meaning of that word has completely changed into a reverse context. So what is happening also with the word dissent in today, I feel that there is almost like a greed or a kind of a hijacking tendency to appropriate that word and maybe kill that word. The idea of dissent itself gets murdered in today's context. I think I am seeing that as one of the biggest fears. Yeah, that's what.
I think when Riaz spoke, he spoke about the cosmopolitanism of Kochi as one of the sort of driving factors, driving objectives of the ecosystem which the Biennale seeks to construct here. And I think it's been very successful. I must say I've come here for the second time, and I'd like to congratulate the organizers for having been able to create this ecosystem, particularly in a context where in the last few years particularly we've been seeing a completely different kind of environment in the country, where all dissent, or forget about dissent, any kind of expression of views which are different are exposed to crackdowns. I can only talk about it in terms of crackdowns. I don't see that kind of freedom in the country these days. We've grown up in this country and we've seen freedom. But at the moment, in the last few years, we've seen a crackdown which has come down, which is aimed at any kind of expression of difference, different opinion. I mean, we heard one view here about an artistic practice, but if you look at what's been happening in the last couple of years, what you eat, what you wear, what you say, this is coming under attack in a way which is, I'd like to hear the opinions of the people who are sitting on the panel about this. Because I value this Biennale precisely because it stands as a free space against that poison which is dividing our society at present.
Okay, we have time for one more. Just
I thought you guys have to respond to that.
Obviously, because only last 2 years were being mentioned, so it is pretty obvious that this is a political question and it is being addressed to the person who is a member of BJP, which happens to be me at this point of time. But I also would like to remind you, as member of the Anna Hazare movement, let me remind you, in 2011, an octogenarian like Anna Hazare was thrown into the jail for protesting against corruption, and all of us had it and were beaten up on a regular basis. I would remind you of Kudannakulam, which has happened right now. I would like to remind you of Asim Trivedi and there was a charge of sedition against him because he made some cartoons. I would like to
What is
remind
this,
you of the
competitive intolerance?
I would like to tell you about the Taslima Nasreen. I would like to tell you about Salman Rushdie and many, many such examples. So they've been having, this has been there in a political discourse, and this is something that as a member of any party, one should fight against, whether as a member of that party or just as a regular citizen. So they've happened, we choose to notice what we want to notice. And we discard what we don't want to. But there have been many, many others, and I could remind you of the same. But this is not the time to remind each other about what has happened before and what is not happening now. I think it's important to work towards a more collaborative effort and in creating a more liberal space within the party, for the people within the parties, as well as a larger space for citizens. So if you notice intolerance of only one kind and not the other, then you're also being intolerant to some degree. And you must observe that about yourself as well.
Let me just say that I do think honestly that this is an ongoing struggle that does transcend politics. I mean, I can speak as a member of the lately ruling dispensation, now rejected by the electorate, who nonetheless stood up for Taslima Nasreen, stood up for Salman Rushdie, opposed the arrest of Asim Trivedi publicly, and so on. So I feel that my voice, to the extent that I have had a meaningful voice in public life in India, has consistently been in favor of enlarging our freedoms. There have been a few occasions, such as the one I mentioned half an hour ago, in which I had to choose silence for political reasons, but most of the time I have actually had the foolhardiness to express my dissent, but always in the direction of speaking for the enlargement of our freedoms. Even now, as a member of parliament, my private members' bills are all about enlarging our constitutional rights to enjoy the freedoms that we have been granted in theory but not allowed to exercise in practice. Everything from my attempts to amend the sedition law, my attempt to read down Section 377 on the LGBT community, my attempt to declassify public records so governments can't keep secrets from us in the name of national security, all sorts of things, my bill to improve the working conditions of domestic workers. All of these bills which are out there on public record have a consistent effort to try and enlarge the space for the freedoms of all of us. Not just those who can articulate their dissent. Very often our domestic workers can't, for example. Though I must say that on a panel, my dear, if you didn't have people who could articulate their views, you'd have a very boring panel. So some articulation should not be held against people. But yes, I think that the vocabulary we use reflects our own biases and limitations, as well as our advantages, our education, our orientations, and that is normal. I would just say that the lady has pointed to some things, Shazia pointed to some others. In a different period, a third person could point to yet other things. I believe in every society, but certainly as Indians we should be concerned about India. We are facing a daily, ongoing struggle to preserve our freedoms and to expand their scope and to resist those in power. And that's where hierarchy again comes in. Those in power who would abridge, restrain, restrict, or even eliminate those freedoms. So whoever is in power, voices must continue to be raised for freedom within, of course, the realm of what is politically possible. There are things that are not possible in our society which others would consider to be part of their freedom. I've acknowledged that a certain amount of cultural relativism comes in. That, you know, the clothes, for example, or lack thereof, that a woman might be able to wear on the beaches of Copacabana would not be what she can wear on the beaches of Goa. Now, that may be an infringement of her freedom to do so, but that is unfortunately the cultural context in which she would be visiting that beach. So some allowances we have to keep making for our realities, but within, I hope, an overall commitment to freedom.
Okay, there is one more question. Sorry. Yeah.
There's a gentleman right at the back who had, oh, and there's a lady here with the mic.
Actually, my question is for Shazia because she brought out a very important point of freedom of the individual versus freedom of the society. And I understand that you actually are very involved with the entire gender space within our political discourse, which very frankly is almost missing. I mean, there is no space for gender politics, it's almost zero in our public discourse. I bring it out especially in the point of something like, for example, the marital rape, okay, where the right of an individual to live a life free of violence and free of forced sex is actually considered subservient to the right of the institution of marriage, which is a societal construct. So I would like you to respond to that.
Well, I would like to speak in my personal capacity here, and for rape, and I've been part of I work for the Nirbhaya Foundation. I work full-time with Jyoti's mother, even now I work with them. And I was part of the Nirbhaya, the entire movement that happened, and we've been putting forth these points of view. Now, when it comes to marital rape per se, just to prove rape for a regular woman, it is so difficult. Now, we are looking at, I know it sounds terrible, but if you look at a calibrated approach, it works better. If we talk about marital rape, I'm all for it. Women would go forth and make that case, but it's very, very difficult really in many times to actually prove it. So we have to create the legal construct, the parameters, so to speak. Yes, so that conversation must be kept alive. And the framework has to be made ready. The protocol with which the agencies would look at a case of marital rape, making sure that there is no discrimination against men also, so to speak, has to be maintained. So there has to be...
Shazia, it depends on how you frame the question. To be honest, the men and your party's government have taken the view that essentially rape, I beg your pardon, marriage involves certain conjugal entitlements and therefore they cannot ever be rape. Whereas my point is that rape is not about sex, it's about violence.
It's about power. It's an act of not
marriage
passion, but
does
an act
not
of power.
entitle you to beat your spouse violently, nor does it entitle you to rape your spouse. And that, to my mind, is the view we must take.
I agree with that. One agrees with all of that. I was talking about when you make a law or work towards making a law, what is, when you have a conversation on the subject, what is the legal framework or checklist or checks and balances that you provide to ensure to a speedy passage of even a private member's bill in this regard? True, but one can seek divorce on grounds of domestic violence too, and lot of lawyers. I've discussed this subject at length. A lot of lawyers would construe rape as part of that violence, but what you prescribe here now is actual criminal prosecution against those husbands who rape their wives, and if wives were to raise that issue. So the point that I'm making now, we've had this discussion, there are a lot of opinions within a party or within groups, legal fraternity as well, as to how would you ensure the proving of that rape within the precincts of the house. Because to prove rape in this country, even in public spaces, is so difficult.
It's important. Yeah, I think just prosecuting somebody for rape is extremely difficult.
And it is deeply entrenched a patriarchal culture, so to speak. So when marriage is considered, yes, it is a license to even rape. So I think it's, in a society, in a certain way, women are properties and commodities.